fuel, give me fire, give me that which I desire.
Fuel, the podcast for fixing underperformance and evolving leadership within the automotive industry. Fuel is bringing you the latest in proven strategies and techniques that can take your service department to the next level.
All righty. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Fuel Podcast here. I've got Rick Ulin with me. How you doing, brother?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you coming on. So, Rick, for the listeners, if you don't mind, just kind of give a little bit of background about yourself.
Well, currently I'm the education team lead instructor at the NCM Institute in Kansas City, but that's coming off of 36 years in retail at the dealership level. Started in the parts department back in the early days on roller skates, back before the OSHA era, back in the book era, pre-microfiche, all that. Worked my way through fixed ops and then transitioned into variable about halfway through my career and ended up running dealerships at the end, but always ran them through a fixed ops brain. So passionate about the business, and I just enjoy this part of my career, just giving back to it in the classroom.
Awesome, brother, man. Well, I'm interested in picking your brain about something that's kind of started to develop a little bit more in a lot of conversations I've been having. When you're doing these training sessions or when you're out there and you're kind of working with people, how do we start to address the issue of turnover? And not so much technician turnover. That's been a big issue and a topic we've gone into. But I would say we would maybe redirect that to advisor turnover. So is there anything you can add to that?
Yeah, just a huge issue. 3 years in a row, it keeps shaving a few months off, just under 2.5 years now, average turn on an advisor. It's down at the level of, well, unfortunately, salespeople on the showroom floor, which that has been a notorious turnover area. We haven't had that at the advisor level. So what we're dealing with is new people coming into the business that really aren't trained in the disciplines, and it's showing up. It's showing up in the proficiency of what they can do on the drive, obviously. So
how will we make? Well, first off, let's assess the issue. Like what would be contributing to advisor turnover?
Well, I do think a lot of it is just lack of training disciplines. I think as dealerships over the years, and let's be honest, and I've been involved in them, in the past, there's no like set business manual where you walk in and it's like, here's your service department operations manual. Here's your service department accounting manual. There's manuals that exist to some degree, but not specific to your store. And so, they're built by the people that operate them. It's that, and over time, they lose some foundational elements. And so people come into the business, they have high aspirations, but without good training and disciplines to learn how to do the job, eventually I think they get frustrated and the job is stressful. It's a stressful job. So if the income doesn't match the stress level at some point, it starts to get to the point where it's not worth it. And I think that's what we see a lot of early exits. And maybe we're failing them a little bit there.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I mean, I remember coming in, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, here's a DMS and here's some customers, get after it.
Yeah.
And so it's the meat grinder of kind of getting through the mix. And I think we're all kind of accustomed to it in the automotive industry of, figure it out, as you kind of go along. But I like you're saying that we're kind of lacking in the process. So if we were working with a store, if we were working with some people and we said, hey, if you're going to start instituting a process of retaining advisors, really retaining advisors, where would be the first step that you could take, a service manager, or I would say, how can you start getting the general managers and things of those nature involved in the process as well?
Well, I mean, I think the big thing is always show me the money. So I think you do have to show them how the math works. And how everybody's supposed to make the money in the process. There's plenty to go around if we're making the right margin on the labor and if people are selling at the right hours per RO. And I think that deficiency on the drive, if we're losing RO count coming through the drive, which is another thing we can get to, that's one thing. But when we start losing our hours per RO, that's where it really starts to stack up. And usually with that turnover, that's an automatic. The person walking in day one is not going to be as proficient as the person who exited that's been there several years. So typically, that loss of production, everybody feels it. and the technician feels it in the hours that they get to turn, and then, that's what pays for everything. So we really have to tie it out, and they have to understand as an advisor, they're a salesperson. I know the title says advisor. It sounds great. Consultant sounds great. Writer sounds very, sterile. But they're a salesperson, and we need them to produce at a certain level. They have a requirement. So giving them a true education day one of what the expectation is and how to set the bar is something that's just kind of missing. We need to get back to the basics there, I think.
No, I love that. I mean, in relating general managers back into fixed ops, sometimes they're a little, no, I wouldn't say intimidated, but they're just, kind of a little displaced. I'm over here, you're over there. I got a guy for that.
Yeah.
I got a FOD, I got a service manager that can handle that. But I think what you're hitting on is a good process they can get more involved in to say, how easy is the onboarding for new people? A lot of people have very complicated, write-up processes, of how they use documentation. You got to use 7 different opcodes to write up an engine concern and things of that nature.
Right.
So, I mean, from the service side, I would say the easier you can make your process, as far as somebody who's never written service, an easier process of writing up tickets and interpreting that. But I would like to get your thoughts on, especially newer service writers, how much should they rely on what the technicians bringing them for recommendations?
Well, they have an obligation. Let's put it that way. In other words, there's so much we look at it two ways. It's the advisor's responsibility during the write-up and the menu presentation, the walk-around process, to get that mileage-based stuff, right? The 15K if it's due, the fuel induction service, a fuel transfer service, a brake fluid exchange, something to that nature. If that stuff is due by time and mileage, that's the advisor's responsibility at write-up. So we want technicians in the shop looking for repair opportunities, looking at the strut leaks and the front timing cover reseals and the different opportunities that, we find in the shop. And then we need to close 40% of that when it comes back. So if we get 40 hours of recommendation coming from my team, I need to close 16 hours of that as an advisor. That's what we say at the Institute, 40%. So just tracking everybody, showing them like what good is and what average is and what's benchmark and what's better than and what's world class and what do these numbers look like. And I think, they don't even know these things. And when you put it in that content and you show them like the number of opportunities on tires that roll through the drive, what they should be selling, with how many tires should be needed and how many you should be selling, you can put the math together to prove that the job is very lucrative. And all they need to learn is how to close those opportunities and how to seek those opportunities. So, it just goes back to educating the math, and there's no book on it. So each store's process on how they operate on the drive, right, is going to determine what their results are.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it right on the head, and I also think it kind of gets missed a little bit when we're putting goals out there, and again, kind of putting the math behind it. A lot of times you'll say, "Hey, we got to sell 100 alignments this month." Okay, so seems like a pretty substantial number, but are we breaking it down for certain people? Based on what you're doing, the opportunity that's being presented. I mean, we're really only looking at one more day. Can you find one more day? And I like the onboarding idea of the process when it's separated from what the technicians look at versus what the advisor looks at. So ease of being able to write up an RO, but also having a very easy process of training them. Can you read history? Can you look at the history of the vehicle and just understand what they're due for based off of time and mileage? And again, we're salespeople. We're going to sell features, benefits, and advantages of doing those services. I would say you could go as far as pressing automotive maintenance for the vehicles because you got to drive on the same roads they do. So it's one of those things where I want your car. I'm advising you to be, for this visit, you're here to be in top pristine, but not also being afraid of hearing that word no. I mean, as long as you're asking for what they need that day, and then kind of bring it to them. But I like what you're saying with the math. Just break it down. Give it to them in realistic terms where they can kind of get their hands around it and kind of understand it. at an easier pace instead of that substantial number we're looking at the high end.
Yeah, I think sometimes advisors will, I'm at an hour, I'm at 1.2, and this person next to me is at 2 hours per RO. And I think it's because they can close the MPI hours coming out of the shop better. That's my first thought, is they're just better at closing those hours. But the reality is they're probably better at doing a walk around. They're probably better at doing a little pre-write work on the previous day for the work that they've got coming in. They're better at taking care of their special order business. They're better at being a service consultant and doing all those tactical things during that need to be done, all the status updates and all those things. And because of that, they sell more work. So it's more of really showing them that along the road to the sale and service, each part of that lends to your overall hours per RO. If you're good at this part, you're going to get a little bit of activity here. You're going to get a little result here. And without those bits and pieces along the way, they just end up with an hour 1.1, and they're just typical. And I think that makes that job a stressful job. They're never going to make the right money. It's there to be made, but they never make it. And then that's the flashpoint, I think, when they give up.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think also something that's kind of misdirected is the tasks you have to do. Here's all the tasks you got to do. You got to do. Go get them. Right. You got to do your walk around. You got to do this. You got to do that. You got to follow up with this. You got to do the call. And in some cases, doing cashiering. So I wouldn't say that it's so much looking at a task list as starting to allocate time. Understanding the allocation of time to do that one job, and then move on to the next thing to kind of structure your day a little bit better.
So I'm glad you brought that up. I actually wrote this little note here, and it was like, are we blaming the generation of learners, right? Are we blaming the advisors for not being efficient, right? And on top of their business, or should we actually be blaming the generation of the trainers and leaders whose process it is that they're functioning within? Because ultimately, you want to build a process that's systemic, right? It's like someone leaves, someone plugs in. The process is strong and holds. You have to plug in and adapt and run within the process. We'll talk about a Big Mac is 2 LB patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, all that stuff. If you decide you want to make it another way, you don't last long, right? But in our business, somehow we get people that get out there on the service drive and start to do things their own way, and they actually do last long. And so, that process starts to melt down. And then if they're not held accountable, then I don't have to do it, and things come apart. And then you don't have that systemic process that's easy to hold on to. So it's a discipline thing, and working your team through that. They have to buy in to want that. Nobody wants to be, the word discipline scares people. We're talking more from if you can get through the daily grind, eventually you start to see the result. Right? Just with anything. So the same thing in getting your service drive process tied down and built out to where it functions efficiently.
Absolutely. I mean, the biggest struggle is getting out of when you get in that groove, that black cloud groove. When the phone's ringing, you got to get this together, you got to call that person, this person's standing in front of you, a salesman's coming back asking you for something, a technician's barking at you. It's being able to control your environment a little bit better, and allocation of what am I focusing on right now to get that done. And so I think it's really misguided in some cases, to give people structure. I like what you said. It starts off as a base foundation, but then you start to understand what you can do with your skills. You're really, really good at a walk around, so what are we identifying and what are you not really, really good at? And then reallocating some of that time over here to get better at that, to understand where we need to put at it. But I think the ease of onboarding, is going to be the easiest way to, like you said, you have a systemic process that allows you to plug people in and let's roll. And it's going to make it much easier for people to get more comfortable. So that, in my my view, would be kind of that rolls into retention. It's easier to get comfortable, it's easier to get in the groove, and it's easier to retain your advisors. Is that kind of along the lines you're thinking?
Yeah, and I think you've got to be realistic. I don't think it's a 30-day job. I don't think you got to ask the dealer, do you want to put this person in front of your client base before they're ready? Right? When every client's precious, retention is tough. And so having a true process when they're onboarded that where they build confidence and they kind of graduate to the floor process is what we should have. And because, we have the turnover pressure we have, we put them in there too quick. That doesn't help them.
Right.
Or, we give them a sponsor. Here, you work with Bill or Jane today, and they're going to show you what to do. Well, no, you're going to learn what Bill or Jane does. You're not going to learn the store's process if you don't have a good discipline process that's documented. So onboarding, when I came to NCM, it was the best onboarding experience I ever had because I had 2 full weeks of daily agenda, exactly what's going to happen, down to the hours, for 2 full weeks. And then before those 2 weeks were up, I was given two more. And so, it's like focus on the things in front of you, right in front of you. Don't worry about the big picture. Let's just get you through each step along the way. And I think, if we could do that with our staff, I think we'd have a lot more success out there. And then if they walk into the arena, understanding like what each of their actions, how it pertains to the role they're in, right? A true understanding of the role, I think they'll be better at it.
Yeah, I like how you say walk into the arena. Mine was welcome to the Thunderdome. Get after it,
Oh, yeah, it's crazy.
have some fun with it, But
Oh, yeah.
I mean, kind of going back to something you said earlier, that is it the people that are doing the job or the people that are training them to do the job? And I think that's one of the biggest aspects as far as people that I talk to, coaching calls that I'm involved in, and things like that. Before we start to point the finger at anybody else, let's look in the mirror. Are they set up for success? Did we give them what they need to be successful? And then we can start looking at pointing the finger, saying, okay, here's some things we got to identify and work on. But I like, is really sitting down and having that hard conversation, with your training team or with yourself, are we doing it the right way to get the best success from it, And so I think that's a huge takeaway, especially from a general manager standpoint. You're over it. Whether you got a guy, and you maybe don't have a whole lot of fixed ops background, sales and service, like you said.
Yep.
So what are you bringing to the table in that aspect of it? So where do
it's
you stand on guys that are, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it's an accountability test. You know, you have to look in the mirror first and be honest about it. Did you give them a job description? Did you give them a pay plan that matches it? Did you give them goals that align to where you're trying to get to, right? Did you line everything up to like, here's your piece, here's our puzzle, here's where you fit into our puzzle, and here's what we expect of you. And if you do these things, this is what you get. And if you do these things at this level, you get even more, right? And if you want to aspire to go to the next level, here's how you do it. So if we give those basic fundamentals and then hold true to that, people don't quit their job, right? They quit their leadership. So
Yep.
without that, when they get lost, and then somebody dangles something that looks a little better, and because you haven't shown them much, next thing you know, you're getting a notice on your desk. So
Yep. But what is that term that's going around now? Like quiet quitting.
yeah,
People start to quiet quitting and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So, just to kind of, change directions just a touch, I wouldn't mind picking your brain on this concept. A lot of times you will start to see seasoned advisors who have been in the business. They start to see things. They almost start to diagnose a little bit on the lane. So how do you kind of talk to about you staying in your lane to an extent? Like you're the advisor, let the technician do his job. Just because you've seen that this is probably a TPMS sensor, or this is probably a wheel speed control module or something like that. Hey, look, you may have an idea, but let's verify it. What do you say to that?
Well, I kind of give that the freedom and flexibility of what are their results, right? So if this is a high level advisor that has great CSI, loyal clientele, runs a good hours per RO, I think you got to give that person a little freedom and flexibility that they've earned that ability. In other words, they're not really outside of their lane. They know the lane. I think it's when you get the younger advisor who starts making that call is where the problem is. So I think it's like if you have to give some grace to that, I believe, when you get to that level. because you want to keep that advisors being sharp. And I think their experience is what makes them sharp. So I don't know, I'm a little mixed there, but I do believe, like, I don't want diagnosing on the drive. We're going to teach that. Don't do it. But I do understand, just like you would, after you've been in the chair long enough, you've seen it. You want to go there, and it's just kind of a natural tendency to do it. So I don't hold them to account for it.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect answer. I mean, I think it depends on the writer and where they're at and what they do, and what kind of rapport they have with their customers and what their success rate. But if they're misdiagnosing stuff all the time, so that would stop talking, that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
I think that's pretty good. So is there any markers, kind of as we start to wrap up, we talked about the onboarding process, we talked about retaining them with a solid, foundation, and keeping that foundation easy to plug in and play with, and then letting them grow, letting them establish that. Is there any key things or key identifiers that you can start to see that an advisor's starting to go down the downslope of holding that position?
Yeah, I think we look at, like, their true output. 500 hours of production in a month is basically supporting about 3 technicians, not even 3. 3 at maybe 100% proficiency. So it's not like you're blowing the cover off the ball. So 500 you should do to pay for, these other 3 people to be here to make this all work. Unfortunately, right now, benchmark is 407. Now, some of that is going to be the CDK numbers are filtering through, and that's going to clean up in time. By the time we get through August numbers, that'll be purified everywhere. But to some degree, it's definitely off. It's been off. Hours per tech per day are under 8, and that's a number that just shows that we say we need more technicians, but we're not as efficient and proficient as we used to be.
Mm-hmm.
So our youth in our drive, and I say youth by not age, but by experience on the drive, is showing up in their ability to sell the hours. And then the technician in the shop, your boomers, are retiring out, and the models are changing so fast, the propensity of having knowledge of, it shows up. Their diagnosis times are being hammered, and stores are behind. That's where they're struggling, is in just the diag type work and keeping up with that type of stuff. So it's affecting the industry. That's why rates are going up, because we got to afford it somehow. People still need to make money. So we're just in that flux where everything is tightening, but I do think it'll come around. But there is a shift that's happening. So we're just in the middle of it.
Yeah, brother. I think, yeah, like again, it's something we got to adapt to. It's always been that way. I like how people think that this is something. No, we've always had to adapt to shifts in the market and shifts in the culture and things like that.
Yep.
So just kind of overcoming it. So, well, Rick, this is gonna wrap up our episode today. What I love to do as we wrap up the episode is give my guest the final say. So, the last thing you kind of want to wrap things up with, put out there.
Just remember the 3 Ps. The people. Ask yourself, how good are they? Well, how good's your roster? You're as good as the depth of your roster. Process. How well do you document things and stay disciplined in your processes? And then, production. It's what it's all about. How well does your shop produce? And I think that if you can focus on those 3 things, you'll be successful in this business.
Awesome, brother. Well, thank you again. This will wrap up another episode of the Fuel Podcast. We'll see you next time. Thank you for joining another episode of the Fuel Podcast. Always be sure to like, follow, or subscribe to be notified when new episodes are being dropped. And click the link below to review any of the show notes for additional information. Or you can email the Fuel Podcast with the link, as we encourage any feedback or any questions or comments from our listeners. Until next time, I'm your host, Alex Keys, with the Fuel Podcast for fixing underperformance and evolving leadership.